The Krag-Jørgensen, a Norwegian-designed repeating rifle, had been adopted in both Denmark and across the world in the United States of America. Now, it's time for it to finally see service back at home. Hi, I'm Othais, and this is the Gevær 1894, a Norwegian Krag-Jørgensen. And to some people, this might very well be the best of the breed. But let's go ahead and squeeze this into the light box and get a closer look. With an overall length of 50.1 inches and weighing in at 9.2 pounds, this is an old-school infantry rifle. It has a 5-round magazine that is of course the unique half capsule with its right side door, and it chambers that 6.5 by 55mm cartridge which was shared between Norway and Sweden. Insert engagement appeal here. Remember to remind viewers that engagement drives how often the show is shared with other new viewers. Also remind them that this has actually worked to grow the channel very rapidly. Thank them for their help. Now, before we get into today's gun, I need to be very clear that this show is going to be built upon not one, but 2 previous episodes. Yes, we recently covered the Danish Krag, and that history factors in strongly here today. But also recall we mentioned a lot about Norway in our Swedish Mauser 1894 episode, and that's for very good reason. To give a brief overview, from 1814 until 1905, Norway shared a common monarch and foreign policy with Sweden. Norway had been in union with Denmark, but following the Napoleonic Wars, it was ceded to Sweden. This was not entirely acceptable to Norwegians, so a brief war was fought, and although they did lose, it created a situation where Norway was roughly independent, and it grew more so through the decades. In 1866, a joint Norwegian and Swedish rifle committee managed to agree to a common rifle and cartridge. With only minor variations between the two, both regions adopted the Remington rolling block, a single-shot breech loader with a 12mm black powder metallic cartridge. At this time, it was a perfectly modern decision. However, as we know, a lot of nations started exploring magazine repeating rifles as early as the mid-1860s. Most found that these mechanisms were too sensitive, too complicated, or provided too weak of a cartridge. Of course, there will be some early exceptions like the Swiss Vetterli. The Norwegian army was not unaware of the advantages of a repeating rifle, but wanting a thing and having that thing can be miles apart. However, as we know from last episode, Norway also had an undiscovered ace in their own arms factory. We saw a lot of Ole Krag in our Danish Krag episode, so let's just quickly orient ourselves. In 1864, this educated military man would join the artillery branch of the army and was assigned to the main arsenal in Christiania. In 1866, he would be commissioned as an aspirant inspector at Kongsberg Waffenfabrik. Around this same time, he was working on a rifle of his own design, a breech loader using an operating lever on the right side of the receiver, and in short order he would combine it with a tubular magazine. While this new gun saw some testing with Norwegian officials, it ultimately did not prove successful. However, Krag's rifle did spark inspiration in one of his peers, an engineer named Axel Petersen, who suggested that the operating arm be ditched and the mechanism worked from the hammer. The end result would be the magazine-feeding Krag-Petersen rifle, which, while adopted in small numbers by the Navy, was ultimately defeated by another rifle, the Yarman. This was a bolt-action black powder rifle now sporting a new 10.15mm cartridge, and thanks to the influence of Ole Krag, it was fitted with a tubular magazine as well. Now, the Yarman and its cartridge were worked up and nominally adopted by a joint Swedish and Norwegian commission, same as the rolling blocks, but ultimately only Norway would produce the rifles in significant numbers. That's because the Yarman came in at just the wrong time, and honestly, it's somewhat for the best that it never truly got off the ground. You see, the Yarman bogged down in arguments about its sights and the proper bayonet to go with the rifle. It also saw some post-adoption improvement, and all of this meant that real production for Norwegian service didn't really become significant until 1886, which, as we know, is when not one but two technologies were hitting the Marshall main stage at once. The first was best exemplified by Edard Rubin, a Swiss engineer that was forwarding the concept of small-bore high-velocity projectiles, which would fly flat, straight, and have just as much lethal impact as a large bore. Recall, the Danes had begun their search for a small-bore repeating rifle in the early 1880s, and would eventually adopt the Krag-Jørgensen 1889, which is, of course, best explored in our previous two episodes. Which is where we saw Ole Krag partner up with Erik Jørgensen and submit their rifle to the Danish Commission, where it beat out the Lee. But that's technically a tangent for our story right now. You see, while Denmark was trialing that Lee rifle and still tinkering with the very earliest of the Krag capsule magazines, France dropped a bomb. Despite being named the model 1886, most of the world did not get a real look at this particular gun until 1887, when its small-bore, flat-shooting 8mm projectile, powered by clean-burning, high-pressure loving smokeless powder, hit the world scene. Every power outside of France felt a little less secure in the face of the Lebel. Yeah, that 8mm smokeless cartridge caused everyone to actively seek their own new ammunition, and in the process, new rifles. Most of the guns in our series have been in direct response to this development, and today's rifle, well, that's going to be no different. For Norway, the Yarman was instantly obsolete. While its rollout continued for want of another rifle, its production would be limited by an immediate search for something better. In addition, Sweden, who had been dragging even behind Norway, ultimately did not issue this jointly approved gun. Heck, Sweden got away with only having converted a relative minority of their old rolling blocks to that new 10.15mm cartridge. As we know in hindsight, they would actually skip it entirely and convert most of their rolling blocks to a smokeless cartridge, one that they found in conjunction, once again, with Norway. They would send our very own Ole Krag to Denmark to study the issue in 1888, which is also when he was selling his rifle to the Danes, so that worked out for him, I guess. By the end of that same year, it was clear to Norwegian officials that they would need to do their own homework on just what would be best going forward. So, in the early months of 1889, Norway would form a small-bore rifle commission, which was charged with finding a cartridge to replace the 10.15mm. This commission was soon reformed as a joint endeavor with Sweden. They started playing mix and match. Yarman, rolling blocks, experimental Lees, and Krags were all trialed in or converted to the new 8mm Danish cartridge. Ultimately, they'd go with converting their existing rolling blocks to the Danish 8mm smokeless cartridge. This was agreed upon in 1890, but the matter of a new cartridge for a new rifle was actually not resolved. From there, the Norwegian Rifle Committee of 1891 started trialing a number of calibers from 7mm up to 8mm, along with yet another load of rifles. Among them, however, would be not only the Danish Krag as we've already seen it, but also an improved model, as Krag and Jørgensen had not been idle. They had patented their gun in November of 1889, not just in Denmark, but around the world. These expenses nearly bankrupted Ole Krag, who had been financing the entire endeavor up until this point. In June of 1889, Denmark would pay both men 30,000 kroner combined, a third of what they had expected, and while this did cover Krag's debts and provide a small split profit besides, it was still not enough for them to feel comfortable. Pushing the further improvement and sale of their rifle would need some extra help. So in late 1890, they founded the Krag-Jørgensen Rifle Company, which sold shares to raise capital for further development and marketing of their invention. Patent rights were assigned to the company, which had the obligation to protect them. Half of any dividends would be paid to the inventors, Krag and Jørgensen. With that settled, these two men would receive state permission to show their rifles abroad, and even made arrangements to purchase barrels from the arsenal at home. Throughout it all, both men continued to improve the rifle, fitting it with a Mauser-styled flag safety, a tipping ejector replaced that flat spring, and various other minor improvements. In showing the rifle internationally, the forward-swinging magazine door was not preferred. It was difficult to load and too easy to spill cartridges back out of. So this would be changed to a horizontally hinged version, which fanned downwards, making for a more bucket-like form in which to dump your ammunition. With these improvements in hand, the new Krag-Jørgensen was included in trials over the winter of 1891 and in 1892. The once again joint rifle committee of Sweden and Norway were searching not just for an action, but were still in the hunt for a cartridge. In 8mm, they had the Mannlicher, Kropatschek, Gevær 1888, Danish Krag. In 7.5, they trialed the Swiss Schmidt-Reuben, and in 7.65, they experienced the Mauser, likely the 1890 variation as adopted by the Ottomans. And of course, there would be a few versions of this improved Krag-Jørgensen. These were trialed in the already adopted Danish 8mm cartridge, and apparently also in a proprietary 7mm. In this same period, Krag and Jørgensen would add yet another upgrade to their rifle. A symmetrical set of 2 front-locking lugs. This feature would definitely improve strength. Also, they introduced a bolt-actuated dust cover, sealing their action when closed. While improvements, these both proved to be costly and required additional manufacturing steps, and so they were rejected in both Norway and the USA, who, by the way, did adopt the rifle in 1892, and that started a whole story which we've thankfully already explored. Alright, so Sweden and Norway are both cranking through different types of rifles and cartridges. The Krag is being improved to keep pace. And in walk 2 additional rifles, the brand new Italian Carcano and the Steyr-produced Gevær 88-derived Schlegel-Milch-styled turned bolt, the sort that was adopted in Romania and later the Netherlands. Now, I'm not sure which of these guns would be the first to introduce the 6.5mm bullet to Norway, but regardless, it was an absolute hit. Norwegian testing revealed a lot of positives. The cartridges were smaller overall and lighter weight, and proved to be lower recoiling. 6.5mm also had the best point-blank range. This being the distance over which an aimed shot would connect with the vital area of a standing soldier. The longer your point-blank range distance, the more forgiving your sight adjustments, and the more likely you are to get a lethal hit even with imperfect range finding. Now you could say, why not go down to 6mm or 5.5mm, make it even faster? Well, they found that terminal performance wasn't so great if they went any lighter or smaller on their bullets. The final testing came through in the summer of 1892 when several Krags and converted Yarmans in both 8mm and 6.5mm were shot comparatively. And for both Sweden and Norway, 6.5mm won their hearts. From there, they moved on to agreeing to adopt the same barrel, and then agreeing on a series of dimensions and bullet weight. They could then move on to rifling pattern and, intermingled with that, the case length and charge of their new cartridge. I will skip some of the mess and just say they agreed on a 6.5 by 55mm cartridge. The charge would vary a little bit until the end, so would the rim, or lack thereof. Norway wanted to go rimless from the very start, but Sweden liked the ease and security of a rimmed cartridge. And so, in the midst of this argument, a compromise was struck. A semi-rimmed cartridge would hopefully give them the room to accomplish their differing goals in either direction. This would become known as the Union cartridge. Now, of course, there was a bit of left hand, right hand going on, and I don't just mean between the two countries. While barrels and cartridges were being worked on, you also had to test magazines and locks. That means looking at our list of repeaters again, which was whittled down to 3 choices that most interested both countries. The Steyr rifle in the largely Romanian pattern, the Mauser 1890 for now, and the Krag-Jørgensen, which actually had evolved a fair bit by this point. These 3 guns would see further comparative tests in the spring of 1893. And it was at this point that our man Ole Krag recused himself from the committee, as testing the locks would be a conflict of interest for him. Despite this measure, it's still a very common assumption that personal affiliation and national pride would play a strong role in the Norwegian opinions during the trials. Now, the guns saw the usual hard testing, so safety, rapidity of action, aimed fire, unaimed fire, endurance shooting, dirt, dust, rust, sabotaged ammunition, so intentionally damaged ammunition, proofing loads, and field serviceability, among other concerns. And in the end, Well, the Norwegians argued only the Krag was designed with single loading in mind, and they still wanted that option despite being more magazine embracing than the Danes. The Steyr in particular could not be considered a single loader at all. The Krag had the fewest small parts on disassembly, with the Mauser having the most. They preferred both the Steyr and Krag cock on open actions as opposed to the Mauser's closing stroke. The Krag's long overhead extractor, mind you this was back when the Mauser had a short extractor, well the long one was preferred. The bolt handle on the Krag was considered easiest and fastest, and in the end, the Steyr was dropped by both countries, and the only guns remaining were the Mauser and the Krag, with a strong Norwegian bias for the latter. And this is where things get sorta hairy. In the middle of all this trialing, the Mauser Model 1893 drops, which has significant improvements. As we know, this would go on to be the rifle preferred by Sweden, and it's somewhat telling that they were the first to receive it. As a matter of fact, they were major contributors in its development. Norway didn't begin testing the 93 until they were well into the trials process. Despite being a massive upgrade to the 1890, to the Norwegians, the 1893 was now another unknown that on the surface did not offer significant advantage. Honestly, its biggest improvements over its precursor had to do with a simpler staggered flush magazine, which wasn't much good as a single loader compared to the Krag, and it had improved extraction, as did the Krag. Honestly, if you count it by the individual merits, you can see how the Norwegians managed to largely disregard the new Mauser. Yes, it was stronger and simpler, but those extras were not entirely necessary in the face of improved handling and a smidge of national pride. Honestly, the biggest advantage from the Norwegian perspective would probably be how the Mauser handled failed rimless ammunition. But at this point, the Swedes had talked them out of rimless ammunition. I don't think I'm going to surprise anyone when I say that Norway decided to take 50 test rifles of only the Krag-Jørgensen into trials in May of 1893. And once that process was underway and there was no going back, you know, all handcrafted, very expensive, well that's when Sweden came a-knocking. And they said, and you guys will never believe this, hey Norway, Paul Mauser says that rimmed rounds are dumb, so we're going rimless. Thought you should know. Good job. Okay, well I guess in the end, that just means that the Norwegians would get the rimless cartridge that they wanted all along. Just took Mauser saying it. Okay, fine, Sweden. Over the summer of 1893, they trialed their Krags and found that overall they were excellent. The few complaints were generally minor, issues with finishing, sling positions, those sorts of things. The only major issue, well, that was with the magazine feed. You see, it was, bear with me, it was too slick, too smooth. I know that sounds a bit insane, but if the feed is so smooth, okay, that you can't feel the resistance of a fresh cartridge coming into the line and being fed into the chamber, then when you're in the prone position, shooting as fast as you can and focusing on your target and not counting ammo, well, you become extremely likely to just lose track of where you are in the magazine, dry cycle, and then dry fire. In combat, that would be precious wasted time. We've seen a lot of designs with interrupting followers in our show, but the Krag's capsule magazine makes that a difficult addition, so the Norwegians were going to have to think on this one. Still, the trials carried on into the fall, much more extensive and with hundreds of cartridges being fired through each of their 50 test guns. By November, they had further reports. Attempts at using any sort of cartridge charger or stripper clip had failed. They were found to be clumsy and ultimately spoiled the ease of being able to single load loose rounds or top up from the same. The idea being if all your ammo comes in clips and you want to get a single or two rounds out of it, you got to sit there and break it out. If your ammo comes loose and in clips, then you're keeping track of two different things. Now the stocks were a little bit weak, so those had to be bulked up. And again, many troops were found to be dry cycling on a non-existent 6th round from the magazine. So it was decided to invest in a device to definitely hold that bolt open when empty. Unfortunately, they didn't yet have one that was fit for service, so they would have to kind of leave room, okay? Going forward, they would adjust the magazine cover and other key dimensions to leave the possibility of a solution in order to hold the bolt open. Now, making those changes aside, the Krag-Jørgensen was recommended for adoption in December of 1893. And overall, the Norwegian Commission, well, they agreed and they put their stamp of approval on it in January of 1894. It would take until April of 1894 for the final touches on the cartridge. Norway would push it up to 700 meters a second using ballastite, though they sort of struggled with various powders until 1897. Cartridge production would be handled domestically by Rodfoss Patronfabrik, which was established in 1896. A royal resolution just 3 days after the final cartridge approval declared the new rifle the model 1894, and so now I get to finally show you this one here. Let's go ahead and take a look. All right, boys and girls, we have another long rifle, so let's get up to the front of this thing, rebalance just a bit, and let's see what we got. Bayonet lug. Adjustable front sight with a split screw, so that's a set it and hopefully forget it. And then we have a clearing, not cleaning rod. And then this segment is actually integral, so you would unthread this, pull it out, and it would become integral to stacking the rifle because you have this very unique eyepiece, okay? So what's going on is the rear of this is a hook for a parade configuration on your sling, so you could draw up that extra sling, hook it there, keeps it nice and tight. But at the front, this hole is designed so that you can feed one of these clearing rods through multiple holes in order to form your rifle stack. I find that to be a little bit dubious on the chances that you start losing your clearing rods, but seems to have worked fine for Norway. If we move down, we see we do not have an upper handguard until the halfway point, and then we have a barrel band that should be set with a swivel, although on these 1894s, I have noticed, and this is just my observation, a lot of them are missing their mid-swivel point. I'm not sure if this was part of the importation process or not, but it's exceedingly common to see them without that sling swivel in this position. Now, as I bring her on down, we're gonna have our actual handguard, we're gonna have our finger groove, we're gonna have, our tangent rear sight. So let me get where we can see that a little bit better. And what this is of course a push and adjust, pops on up. I think this is sighted out to 2,200 meters and all the way down to 100. A true 100 meter zero is uncommon in these early rifles, so I'm surprised to see it here. Although we're gonna see that this is not the original rear sight. So if I move on forward, we have our receiver section, and I'm gonna skip by that for just a moment to see May will be very happy. Semi-pistol grip stock, and honestly, a fairly thin wrist. This is a very comfortable rifle. As we get to the bottom, lower sling swivel, and then at the rear, we have our butt, which actually does have a little service door, and it's, boy, is it tight, and there's nothing in there, so I'll leave that be. But that would have originally had like an oiler, and later they would issue a pull-through rope for cleaning the rifle, so those would be stocked away in there. Now, if I bring her back to the action, we're gonna see that this is a lot like the original Danish with some very key differences. The door is on the right side, just like always, but in this case, we can now open it outwards and then dump our rounds into the top. This is superior in that if you already have rounds in the gun and you open it up, they don't go splashing out if you're not paying attention. Much easier to dump feed, a little harder though, to introduce something like a charger or a stripper clip, but nobody did, so that ultimately ended up working out just fine. Now, specific to the Norwegian on being able to flip this guy open, there is a little access door that you guys might be curious to see. That's right here, has a little lever. I can pop it open, I can look down in there and see the interaction between the spring for our follower and that catchment at the front. You'll see it better in the animation. The short answer is, I can drop some oil in here, I can see if any gunk's gotten built up, I can scrub just a bit and inspect without having to take the whole thing apart for what is a key point of interaction in the gun. This pin is the same pin that has to be driven out to take the door off to really get in there and inspect anyway. Now, let's go back to our bolt, because there are some differences. Unlike the Danish, we no longer have a half-cock safety. We no longer have a later 1910 weird little hook safety. Instead, we have a perfectly normal to us Mauser flag safety. See that guy right there? And so we can flip her over, and that's gonna lock back our cocking piece, lock up our bolt handle, no shooting, no nothing. Now, if we flip her all the way back over, we're back off of safe and we're ready to fire. In this particular case, This does not use any sort of takedown position. So on the Mausers, you would flip this up vertically and use that to help disassemble the bolt. But in this guy, not so much. As a matter of fact, it still removes the same way as the Danish Krag, where you lift the extractor, over rotate, and then pop her free. And then the takedown of the bolt is actually the same, and the internals are almost entirely identical to the Danish Krag. Not really worth doing here if you've seen that previous episode. So, on this particular gun, we do also have the same magazine cutoff in the same position. However, it's been inverted. So magazine is on when down and magazine is off when up. Now, you can't really see that down in there very well because being rimless, it's a little less obvious, but have no fear, that same sort of half circle is rotating in there that we saw before. And while we're there, you might notice this spud sticking through. That's a little, see that guy? That round piece? Well, it is an extension that's coming off of the cover right here, and it's not just there as an anchor. Recall, Norway wanted to include a bolt hold open that proved to be a particularly difficult concept. The first design forwarded by Krag-Jørgensen, well, it worked, but it was pretty flimsy and fairly complicated. It used a spiral spring to press a latch into the path of the bolt. A rising cartridge would somewhat unreliably depress the latch so that it did not block the bolt. Testing of this design revealed it to be, again, complicated, and it often locked the gun open after only the 4th round, and on top of that it was prone to breaking, so Krag himself would dissuade its adoption. However, we can certainly see where they left room in the 1894 for this potential device, with this oversized hole in the receiver filled by a peg that again comes from that magazine cover. Cool. Just so you know, a second, far simpler device was also trialed. This was just a shaped flat hook set inside the magazine cutoff lever. While far less complicated, it was very weak and regularly locked on the 4th round, just like the previous hold open. Ultimately, the Krag would never receive that bolt lock open. The troops would have to learn to count. Alright, let's get a closer look inside of this particular rifle with the help of our X-ray vision and our animator, Bruno.
Just like last time, let's take a look at the magazine before we load it up. From underneath, we can see the follower arm, which moves horizontally across the receiver and features a tipping head to maintain even pressure on the last round. The follower arm is driven by this specifically shaped lug on the magazine door's hinge point. As the magazine door is opened or closed, the lug rotates against the underside of the follower arm, causing it to be driven forward or pulled back. Tension for the system comes from this flat spring, which presses against a hook on the follower arm's hinge point. This spring force creates a bias to keep the action door shut or tensions it open when the door is swung wide over center. Alright, let's load up this gun. Switching the magazine cutoff rolls a half circle pin into camming the first round back down and out of the path of the bolt, which makes our gun a single shot rifle. Turning it back down returns us to repeating fire, and now our first cartridge will feed. Like the previous Danish, we have a long overhead extractor, which now pulls into an improved tipping ejector. Also carried over was the separate firing pin head, which is driven by a large coil spring and attached to a simple cocking piece. This uses a standard notch which engages on the sear surface of the trigger group. While the sear arrangement is similar to the previous Danish, the Norwegian Krag is now powered by a coil spring and sports a very long 2-stage pull. This is a cock on open action, by the way, with a camming surface at the back of the bolt body, driving the cocking piece rearward as the bolt handle is lifted. The safety is a standard Mauser flag, which, when rotated, wedges the cocking piece back just a bit and also turns a half-circle pin into the bolt body, preventing the action from being opened. All in all, a pretty ingenious system and surprisingly simple despite its complex interactions. Okay, let's get this out to the range.
I love the smell of milsurp in the morning. Now, of course, if you're going to have an infantry rifle, you're going to need a bayonet. Ultimately, the Norwegians went with a modified Danish knife with an 8½ inch blade. These would be produced at home and on contract with Steyr and Husqvarna in Sweden. And I suppose now is a good time as any to talk about production. Unlike the Yarman, the Krag-Jørgensen was going to require not only more rifles, but also more rapid acquisition. Look at the original plan: convert rolling blocks to 10mm and start making Yarmans. This would fairly quickly rearm your troops without leaving the army particularly weak against contemporary opponents in the pre-smokeless era. Not everyone would even need the new repeater, so lots of rolling blocks could stay with non-frontline troops. With the introduction of the new 6.5mm smokeless cartridge, both of these guns would need to be replaced entirely. The estimated need for Krags in 1894 was 77,000 rifles and carbines. The native Kongsberg Våpenfabrik had been expanded starting in 1892 in preparation for this order. 77 new machines were acquired, with over 100 more before 1900. In that same period, the workforce would double. Even so, as was, Kongsberg could handle perhaps 5,000 rifles a year. With shift work, it could be pushed as high as 8,000. That would mean nearly a decade for rearmament, and didn't include any potential growth of the army or a martial emergency, although it also didn't include massive expansion of Kongsberg either. And this is where you have to start thinking financially. If you want a lot of guns right now, but you aren't always going to want a lot of guns in production, well, expanding the factory, for just 5 years and then collapsing it back down is extremely expensive and can deeply impact the local economy. So what do? Well, while you make what you can at home, you also look for someone who is already good at making a lot of guns. Norway would put out requests at arsenals around Europe, and as bids for the contract came in, they would send out our own Ole Krag and another engineer to inspect each facility. And in the end, well, they chose Fabriek Nationale in Belgium. They would sign a contract in December of 1894 for 20,000 rifles with bayonets, and these were priced at 75 franc a pop. FN sent an engineer of their own to Norway to study the rifle and adjust it for easier mass production. Both Krag and Jørgensen would spend some time in Liège in order to assist there with the startup, but by September of 1895, Krag wrote home that FN had accomplished very little. FN had also already breached a contract for Mauser rifles and was severely behind schedule. There was no sign that Norway would have significant numbers of rifles for their troop exercises in 1896, so the contract was broken in November. And the next year, the Norwegian state would win a lawsuit against Fabriek Nationale for losses incurred and penalties on that failed contract. Next up, OEWG Steyr in Austria, who signed their contract that same November of 1895. The initial contract was for 20,000 rifles and bayonets. This would be followed by 9,000 more in August of 1896, and an additional 4,500 rifles without bayonets for national sport shooting. The cost of the rifles alone was 75 franc, with 5 franc extra per bayonet. Steyr took some of the FN improvements and also went further on their own. While these minor changes sped production and sometimes even strengthened the rifles, Kongsberg was now already producing guns, which means that full parts interchangeability between domestic and foreign-made Krag-Jørgensens was lost. However, to this day, Steyr-made guns are seen as superior by sport shooters and are prized over the Kongsberg domestics. Now, the Steyr guns began arriving in Norway in 1897, which is the same year that they requested another 1,000 rifles, which results in a funny story. Norwegian Inspector Pask, who was stationed at Steyr, asked about the possibility of 1,000 additional new rifles, like I said. He was told offhand that they probably wouldn't even need to do new castings and could make the lot from discarded scrap forgings from the previous work. Pask did not like this very much, and so asked to see the scrapped forgings. When Steyr gathered them for inspection, he seized the lot as having already been paid for by Norway. Pask then asked if they could produce the 1,000 additional rifles, with new forgings. And OEWG Steyr said, nope. This bold move, of course, resulted in more arguments, contractual lawsuits were further threatened, and the Norwegians were only pacified with 5,000 free additional bayonets. Cross your T's and dot your I's when you deal with the Norwegian army, folks. They are out for blood. On paper. Alright, so Norway finally has its new rifle. Domestic and foreign production have bulked up the inventory, and yet they keep needing more and more. Remember, in 1894, they estimated needing 77,000 rifles, but by 1903, the number had increased to 118,000 for the Army, let alone a few thousand for the Navy. Some of this martial expansion probably came from the growing displeasure between Norway and Sweden over the Union. I won't go into the politics of it here, but the summer of 1905 would be tense, as a series of political maneuvers that started back in May would ultimately end the Union in October. Thankfully, armed conflict was not a feature of this event. Now, the Norwegian Krags would not see a true fight until World War II. However, they did need to bulk up for World War I, which I don't want to cover in too much detail at this particular point. We're already in a fairly heavy episode. We'll talk more about that next time. But let's look at the production figures at least. Domestic production of the long rifles carried on from 1895 until they were dropped in 1922. The estimated total was 122,817 Kongsberg rifles. On top of that, you add in the Steyr contract for 29,000 for the Army, although don't add the 4,500 for private shooters because I'm not including Kongsberg private production numbers, and we get our rough total. There would be, by the way, an attempt to replace the 1894 as the main infantry rifle of Norway even before World War I. However, that's our topic for next time. We're not quite done for now though, because I have to share one very interesting pre-war modification of the Krag 1894 before I go. In 1910, 1,000 rifles were produced with scopes. These were the result of efforts by Johan Enger, a member of the National Shooting Board, who collaborated with our aforementioned Captain Pask. These men wanted 24 scoped rifles per infantry battalion. This number would never be reached, sadly. I won't go into the deep details, but over years of trials and experimentation, they ultimately managed to adopt the German-made Voigtlander 4x magnification scope. These very early military sniper rifles were sadly not entirely reliable. They commonly didn't hold zero and could be fairly fragile. Numerous attempts were made to improve them, but they were ultimately too ambitious for their time and beyond the sort of resources available to Norway. Okay, we've covered some good ground, but I'm going to stop listing models for this episode and we'll pick up next time. Instead, let me leave you with one piece of interesting lore. Many will claim that the Norwegians devised a sneaky trick when it came to their ammunition. You see, years into production of both the Krag-Jørgensen and Mausers in 6.5, people started noticing that Swedish ammo could be chambered and shot fine in Norwegian rifles, but Norwegian ammo was often too tight in the Swedish Mausers, sometimes to the point of failing to chamber. This, of course, caused a huge fight in the press and accusations abounded, but in the end, it turns out both countries were working from the same drafted dimensions for that 6.5 by 55mm cartridge. Sweden had leaned on the smaller acceptable tolerance numbers, trying to get that precision fit, you know? Norwegians had thought, better to err on the side of caution. They had worked their chambers to the maximum tolerance point, and their ammunition production had naturally kind of followed along behind that in the process. In the end, it was settled with some minor adjustment and a realization that only brand spanking new Swedish Mausers were almost incapable of chambering the Norwegian ammo. But with a little wear, yeah, okay. Alright, I think that has us for now. I'll definitely be back next episode with even more. There's some holes to plug because the Norwegians are nowhere near done with the Krag. But before you go, maybe stick around and hear a bit from our demonstrator, Mae, and get her opinion on the Norwegian 1894. Alright, once more we've made room for Mae, and we have squeezed in this very long Norwegian 1894 Krag.
Yeah, it's up there, isn't it?
We've done a fair few Krag episodes, and we'll talk more about that at the end of all this, but this is not the last Krag, no.
There's more Krags?
Oh, there's more Krags. And we'll talk. But we are on the last country of the major Krag countries, because when you think of Krag-Jørgensens, you think of the Danish Krag, the U.S. Krag, and now the Norwegian. And it goes in that order, but people don't think of that because the U.S. comes back around and does more work on their Krags. So you have the Danes in 89, the U.S. takes it in 92, and that's where the 1892 Krag is. And if you watch our U.S. Krag episode, the 1892 Krags are somewhere between this and the Danish. Then the Norwegians do this, and then later the U.S. goes through a series of improvements that ultimately end up with the 1898, which ends up even more like this. So you've sort of been on either side of this gun, is what I'm saying. Like, you've been on a gun that was updated after this gun.
I've tasted a fair sampling of Krags at this point.
Right. How does the Norwegian Krag feel compared to other Krags?
So we're coming off the Danish Krag, so let's talk about comparing it to the rifle, the 8910.
Yeah, so this guy.
Yes, that big honker, which... Right. You know, it's interesting. The weights between these two are not that far off. I think that one's like 0.2 pounds more for weight, but it just feels beefier. It feels stockier, I suppose.
Yeah, thicker wristed, thicker wood up here.
Everything about it feels like it's heavier, and this one just feels so lean by comparison. It's actually really nice. We've gone from a straight bolt to a turn down. Well, not turn down. It's more like...
straight at a different angle.
Yeah, straight at a different angle, which... not a bad angle, to be fair. It drops you pretty close to that trigger, which is kind of nice. We've gone from that side button safety to a flag style safety, which I'm used to those, but honestly, I still think that button safety is pretty rapid for use.
I'm going to tell you from, bench position, or like if you're actually laid out shooting with this thing, you can operate the safety one-handed with this guy. On that one, you can use your right hand, but you have to take it off of what you're doing or wrap the wrist all the way around or what. This one, you can operate the safety from the firing position. So, but don't forget though, this comes out in 1910.
That's true. That is a later one.
This gun only had a half cock originally. So the Norwegians had not seen this safety when they did that, which was the flag safety.
And then obviously, like we said, the balance with the weight combined, I think this one balances out better. Like, it doesn't feel as muzzle heavy. It definitely feels like I'm able to adjust my grip however I'd like without it really feeling like it's going off.
Yeah, I'm pretty far forward of that sight. You're behind your sight, close to the magazine. That may be the barrel jacket in this case.
It could very well be. And then obviously, which I'm sure some people were screaming at the screen, the style of loading on these two, drastically different. We've gone from that front door access to the bucket style.
Right.
And honestly, I find the bucket is much easier to load into. I don't have to worry about, like I did on the 8910, having to pull my rounds back ever so slightly, because as we mentioned before, I'd have to worry about the tip of the round nudging into the hinge up at the front of the door, and it wouldn't load in as smoothly as I'd like. Whereas this one, the bucket, I really can just dump and go.
Yeah, it was her first time using the Danish Krag when we filmed that one, and we had to take, I think, like 3 takes in order to load it.
Somehow I managed to do that. And it's because obviously you're tipping it forward for 2 reasons. 1 being more muzzle heavy, and 2, you want the door to hang open, so you're not going to want to hang it back unnecessarily.
It can definitely hold itself open, by the way, but you don't know that instinctively. You want to angle it down.
Instinctively, I definitely did want to hold it forward, but regardless, I had to worry about that nose tip, whereas this one, not really so much.
Yeah, did you have any jams trying to load that thing up?
No, actually, that was the best part. For this one, I just got to dump and go each time, so our takes that we had for on range were pretty much just single takes. We took extra footage if we wanted to. Yeah.
Now, other differences is, of course, instead of the barrel jacket, like we mentioned before it being here, that just has a handguard.
Which is nice. I can now grip it wherever I want, which is fantastic, honestly, especially when I get up to bayonet fighting. That's really going to come in handy.
Well, in theory, though, this barrel jacket's supposed to insulate the entire length of the barrel. So you're getting a half-length handguard there, whereas on this, you get, theoretically, a full-length handguard. It's just that it's in the form of an easily dented and rust attracting system.
You know, one of these days I'd like to have enough rounds to actually be able to test it out and see how many rounds it would take to where I could not handle the heat through a barrel jacket on that guy for handling just with my hands directly.
Yeah, that's actually a very tricky comparison to do because they're in 2 different cartridges.
That's true.
And what you're going to find is when you hand load, you can get a dang near perfect bullet, but not always. So we won't be able to have the same jacketed bullet that they had in the exact same micro diameter, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So if one of these has more friction in the barrel because of the hand-loaded ammo with a different jacketing technology than what was expected, then our temperature comparisons aren't going to be fair because that's not how they were actually shot. Like, it's really weird how hard it is to recreate the exact ammo conditions to get a real understanding of those little key differences.
It's important to dream, though, right?
Oh, any day.
And then the magazine cutoff on this one I noticed is way nicer than it was on the Danish because it's flush here up to the side, and then they have basically milled out some of the wood right here to create a little indent so that it can be even flusher to the side so that I'm not worried this is going to snag on anything. Plus, I've got a little extra purchase to really flip it on and off if I want to.
Now, most of the stuff you're describing would have been true of, say, a U.S. 1892. I mean, not every little detail, but we're getting
into that territory,
You're describing
aren't
a
we?
U.S. 1892 in a lot of ways. What's really different from the U.S. rifle in this gun?
So I would honestly say we're looking at the sights, but then again, depending on when it was made, the sights could vary.
Right. So you have a tangent rear sight. This has a ladder. The U.S. started with a ladder like this. Then they went to another ladder like this.
Yep.
Then they went to a tangent. Then they went to a Buffington ladder. Then they went to a... yeah.
So it just depends on what dice you rolled for what you got, effectively.
Well, how long you wait.
When. Yeah. And then the semi-pistol grip.
That is completely unique.
Yeah, I love the semi-pistol grip on this because, granted, you're right here close to the trigger, but man, that pull-in you get with it is just so tight and perfect. It's beautiful.
Yeah, these guys have a narrower stock in my mind too. I know I'm holding up against the Danish. It's very thick.
Thin rest feeling, especially.
Right.
Yeah.
These stocks, almost for a military rifle, they're actually kind of alarming to me because I'm not used to feeling them that thin.
So it worries you a little bit?
Well, I thought it might be sanded, but if you looked at this one carefully, all the wood's where it belongs. There's so this has never been sanded. And so it's just a really nice profile that reminds me almost of like an old Winchester 1897 shotgun.
Yeah, really, it does.
And it's fantastic feeling. I don't know if I trust it. It's too good, you know what I mean?
I could see it being something that would worry you potentially, but I guess it depends on the cartridge and how it handles.
Well, you already mentioned the sights, so let me set this away for a second without smashing anything in the process.
Yeah, that's a task in this room.
Yeah, a 10 by 10 room, and we have to get all this done. So, you're talking about the sights. How are they in terms of actually lining up and taking your shot? Because the other thing that's different about this gun is the ammunition. I think we're now in that phase where you have to tell us what it's like to shoot it.
All right, lining up my sights, and you know what? It's not as fast a read as the Danish long rifle is. Those rear sights on the Danish long rifle are incredibly tall. They were a fast read. I still love them, even though they're more susceptible. They're easier to get dinged up, I think. And granted, while these may be safer and they may be able to withstand a few more hits, I guess, to the side of them, they're really fine sights, and they just aren't quite as fast as I would like them to be.
Yeah, they're nicer for dialing in tight.
Yeah, I mean, if I'm dialing it tight, target long ways away, yeah, that's not bad.
Yeah,
but
they're sharp, but they're fine. And I found that if I had any sort of they're dark sights. If I'm pointing into a dark environment, so it's getting towards dusk.
Sure, okay. The Danish is capable, whereas this one, it's going to take you a little bit of time.
I mean, the Danish aren't perfect, but they're, I mean, Carcarno deep is deep, you know what I mean?
That's deep right there.
But, also bulky, very hard to find sight. But it's kind of hard. I almost just want to get in there and just cut them a little deeper.
Just a little bit.
And adjust and just be done with it. But
that would be all it needed.
So a little slower to pick up, finer to aim.
But they do stick up far enough from the wood up here that I don't think they need to actually mill out any of the wood right here.
The actual tangent itself, the block is tall.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
Just the V-cuts in the middle, you know what I mean? And I've seen worse. Yeah. But it's just, okay.
And then the trigger on this one, really, really, really long first stage on that 2-stage trigger. That has to be the longest pull I have had to date for the series. And then that second stage, it's really short, it's really crisp. It almost feels like a sin that this isn't a single stage gun in general.
from that position.
Yeah.
I've never, by the way, this is not the only Norwegian we've handled.
No, we've handled several, and we thought maybe this was just going to be to this one. No, it's all of them. All of them are like that.
As a matter of fact, when our animator went to take this one apart, he found that someone had shimmed it with plastic. To be honest with you, I had never gone into the gun either, and so once we changed that, it was very odd because I was like, why are these other two Norwegian Krags soggy? Or not soggy, but there's this weirdly long
take-up, yeah.
And then kind of a short trigger, too, which means that you're coming up with it. You can't slide to the bottom.
It's a surprisingly short trigger. It doesn't look it, but it is.
Yeah. So then he found like a plastic wedge that somebody just sort of shimmied in there. So that way it would go ahead and do that first stage a little shorter and then break sooner. So it didn't have to drive the trigger. You didn't have to bury the trigger. But once that was removed, this started acting like all the other ones.
Oh, yeah. Totally identical.
And so I understand what they're going for in this sense. Like, your two stages, in a military sense, your two stages is always going to act as a rudimentary safety. And so, combined with the fine sighting, I can tell you the Norwegian's perspective was like, we're not in a hurry so much as we want to be accurate. And there's going to be this setup, and then you're going to know for sure that you're sitting on that trigger, and then you're going to get that single stage pull. So, if anything, if it weren't for infantry intelligence levels, they probably would have gone to just a single stage trigger to begin with, because it really feels like they're trying to get a single stage trigger with a safety in front of it. You know, that first stage almost serving like the trigger safety on a Glock in my mind.
It does take you a bit to honestly get to the point where it's going to go bang. So I'm not surprised if that was part of their consideration.
Yeah, I haven't seen any notes on it, but that would be my best guess, because it is unusually long.
Yeah, it's just surprisingly long. And then the recoil. That's really all that there is left at this point. And dang, if the recoil on those Norwegian Krags is not nice, that 6.5 cartridge is beautiful in these.
Yeah.
Like, there's nothing to them.
Yeah. You're talking about light recoil, long point blank range, very effective potential cartridge in the bottle-nosed area. And by the way, I get crap for saying bottle-nosed, you know, round ball, non-spitzer, because a lot of people say, don't you mean bottleneck? And it's like, well, no, it's a bottle-nosed cartridge. It could be bottleneck
like
or not case. Yeah. So let's not talk about spitzer yet. That's sort of a little bit further forward.
That's fair.
This gun is chambered for a spitzer cartridge, though. So,
it can handle it.
with all that said, though, you got your mild recoil, you got your tangent sights that are a little fine, but mostly legible.
Right.
You've got your improved magazine, blah, 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 blah.
I like that blah, 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 blah part.
When we talk about the big three, so Denmark, USA, Norway, and I mean big in the literal sense, all the long rifles, none of the carbines. Out of those three long rifles, which one do you think ranks the highest?
So if I'm thinking about ranking the three of them, I'm going to have to put the Danish at the bottom, simply because I don't think that barrel jacket is necessary. They could have just done the adding an extra wood and things like that. And that style of loading, I think, is still I think it's just not quite as fast as I would like the bucket style to be. And a few of these features feel a little more refined, I suppose, on both this and the US Krag. Okay. So I'm going to put that down at the bottom. They
are next generation Krags, by the way. The US and the... But let's give the Danish some credit. Number one, they managed to get to a Spitzer cartridge sooner.
They did.
In that they got to one, and before the 20s. Two... having an 8mm Spitzer is arguably better than a 6.5 Spitzer, because once you get into the Spitzer era, those advantages of the smaller bore kind of start to go away. And then three, the Danish Krag does have, to me, the best manual safety.
I agree. That safety is pretty fantastic, so I am sad that that's down there.
However, none of that makes up for the fact that your bolt handle's in the wind, your barrel jacket's very heavy, and it's very hard to load. I think loading and cycling the bolt and handling are going to be more important than the safety or the nuances of the cartridge at ranges.
The safety's number one in and of itself.
The nuances of the cartridge in excess of 3,000 yards is... in excess of 500 meters, let's say.
Right.
Like, you're getting anything under 500 meters, I think, as long as they're comparative, we're okay. So, okay, Danish sits at the bottom.
Yeah.
Then the 3040 Krag US.
I didn't even say that yet. How did you know?
Okay,
I hadn't even said that yet.
I'm sorry.
Number two is the US Krag. Now, he actually knew where I was going on this one.
I already know our feelings on this.
Yeah, to be fair, this one just has two slight parts of it that bump it up above the U.S. And for me, some people think it's a small thing, but it is a big thing for me for handling the semi-pistol grip. I really do think that puts it up there. And then the other thing is the cartridge. I think that 6.5 cartridge for this one, it does the job. It's rimless, flat shooting. It's a good man-stopping round, especially for the environments it was used in. And the recoil on this was fairly mild by comparison. So I really do think it puts it up there.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting, but that semi-pistol grip makes it a much better repeating dedicated rifle.
Yes.
The straight wrist tends to be a little bit better when you're trying to drop it. And we shoot it that way because of the way we demonstrate the guns. But realistically, if you're working from the shoulder, you're going to keep the semi-pistol grip. You're going to keep, the turn-down bolt handle. You're going to keep all those options.
It makes more sense from the shoulder. But again, since we were dropping it
But the irony is the reason that Krag, persevered against other designs is because it was a better single-shot gun. And yet the Norwegians put a semi-pistol grip on it. So that tells you some things there too. Like it's kind of weird, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, it still feels nicer bedded with a semi-pistol grip, even on a literal single shot gun. It's not always as easy to do the sort of free-handing, and it's also a lot more in terms of trying to pick the grain boundaries for the wood and not having your stock snap and things like that. It gets expensive to do this.
That's true. There is a lot of thought that goes into it. I mean, some countries, didn't they separate out the semi-pistol grip itself and just screw it in separate?
Well, no, what they would do is, because of the semi-pistol grip creating that need, they'd cut the toe and they'd do a different toe. So you see it in, like, Japan and things like that.
Arisakas.
Yeah, but trying to get a piece of wood with the right grain to give you all that length, have the reinforcement through the pistol grip, and then not lose the toe of the gun, it's actually quite difficult.
Take some consideration.
It's a geometric problem. And then that means that you have to use more wood or more expensive wood, or it takes longer, or you have more problems when you cure it and you have a higher failure rate. Making a straight wrist is much easier. So you might want to, if you're military, you might want a straight wrist. I don't know. So I kind of agree with you, though. I would put the Norwegian, impulsively, by the way, just on feel.
Just on feeling?
Yeah, not by the numbers.
Okay.
Which is your favorite of those three rifles?
Yeah, the Norwegian.
There's a lot of exposition.
I had to put some thought into it. I didn't want to make a snap decision. No, but honestly, this one just, it had a better feel to it by comparison. Like I said, the recoil alone was so much nicer, and I could still acquire my target fast enough, and I had that semi-pistol grip. Like, there really were just so many little benefits to it that me personally work better for me.
Yeah, that's fair. I agree. The Norwegian long rifle is probably the nicest of the Krags. So I guess in terms of long Krags then, if this is the nicest of long Krags, how confident do you become in using something like this in something like World War I?
I mean, for World War I, the confidence is still pretty up there because, I mean, if we're talking about what I, consider taking this potentially into battle if I could, if you look at it, I definitely said yes to the U.S. Krag. I mean, it's pretty high up there in my rankings, and there's no way I could turn this down when I see this as a better version of that. So it really does just have all the benefits that the U.S. Krag gave me, and then some extra addition. So
let's talk about a middle of the road, well, not middle of the road because it's a very strong gun, but a gun that had some ups and downs. So a mainline infantry rifle of World War I is the Gevær 98, which you thought was extremely strong, fairly heavy, had your semi-pistol grip, had some other features, but 8mm Mauser cartridge, Spitzer.
Right.
And that horrible Longa Vizier.
That's what I was thinking, of Longa Vizier. So I'm like, I guess it's middle of the ground with that. But.
Right. That's what all these good advantages, and then there's this one thing of sighting just sort of holding it down, right? I'm not saying this beats that because no stripper clip loading. This thing can't beat it. But how close do we get to that sort of confidence level with that being an imperfect gun that still does very well in your book? How far up that scale did we make it? Are we near it, or are we still well below in that Gevær 88 territory?
Yeah, I guess if we're looking at this, I see what you're doing here.
Right. Hold on. Let me make it more clear for the audience. This really is a lot like a Gevær 88 or 8805.
8805, yeah. It's closer to that in terms of the numbers, if you think about it, if you try to rank everything.
So it managed to get to a Spitzer 8mm.
Yep.
Barrel jacket, like really, actually it's very comparable to Germany in those terms.
But we don't have that stripper clip loading.
Well, end block clip. For the 88 end block clip.
Yeah.
For the 8805 stripper clip.
That's what I was thinking.
But this has neither of those advantages.
Right.
And so this actually is almost worse. If you really think of it by the numbers, this gets pretty bad.
Yeah. But on feeling alone, I'd put it really up there with closer to the 98 just because this feels more like an infantry mainline. Yeah, right. This one.
Yeah, the confidence feeling in just getting your hands on that is much higher to me as well. However, if you think about it by the numbers, even something like that Gevær 8805 is going to deliver a Spitzer 8mm with a rapid loading system, a stripper clip. But the bolts and the feel and the double feed issues and so now you get in this feelings land. And for me, I want to put it like Gevær 98, a little, a chunk, 25% below that, maybe this, right? And then I want to put like 88, 8805 way down here. Yeah. But when you really look at the numbers, it's like, ooh.
It should be closer, but it just doesn't feel like it should be.
And maybe that's the allure of the Krag-Jørgensen, because the Krag really does seem to inspire a lot more confidence than it has on the numbers. Like, people hate to hate the Krag.
It just feels so refined. It feels bad to hate something that feels that refined.
There are guns that are absolutely structurally better than this gun, functionally better than this gun, and people are known to hate them. Yeah. I can't find a hater of a Krag.
I really can't either.
So I don't know what that means. Like, how does it tug at our heartstrings?
I don't know. I guess it's just got the right balance, maybe. It's just got the right weird features about it. It's just got the right...
There's something very human about the gun, which is why they're highly collectible. People love them. As a matter of fact, and this is one of the rare instances in which I own one of the guns of the show. This one,
I know, right?
Is mine. And I got this many years ago for a price that you can't get them for now. Sorry, guys.
Sucks to be off.
At the time, it was a good price too. Actually, you know what? I'll tell a personal story.
Okay.
You remember this story, I'm sure, because we met our friend Big Mike with this gun. Because
I think I remember the story.
I went over to a local gun shop and it saw it sit in the rack, and I said, "Ooh!" And I looked at the price, and I went, "They think this is a U.S. Krag or something. Like they priced it like it was out of the U.S." So I said I would like that, and I was poor. Well, I'm still poor, but I was poorer.
It's true.
So I put it on layaway.
I was there. It's true.
And so apparently, unbeknownst to me, as they took it in to put it on layaway, they had a guy that came through that did their gunsmithing from time to time. Big Mike. And Big Mike went, "What's that?" And then they're like, "Oh, somebody just put it on layaway." And he's like, "Let me see that." And he gets a hold of it. He goes, "I want this." And they're like, "Somebody just put it on layaway." He's like, "Why don't you guys tell me this was here?" And so he got really mad. So it goes on layaway, and a few months later, I buy it. And then I take it out to the gun range at like 6 in the morning or whatever to get ahead of the yokels. And it's us, and one older gentleman comes out, and he comes on over. And he's like, "Oh, you got some old stuff, blah, blah, blah." I'm taking stuff out of the cases. We're talking about old guns. And I pull this out, and he looks at it and goes, "Oh, a Norwegian Krag." And he picks it up, and he looks at it. He's like, "Did you get this over at so-and-so gun shop?" And I went, "Oh, yeah. They had it out of real steel, blah, blah, blah." And he just, I don't know. And by the way, the guy's like 6'5". And out of nowhere, he just yells at me. And he's just like, "You son of a bitch!" And he goes on a rant. And then we were friends. But it was
That's how your friendship happened.
So
that's how like half of his friendships happen, though.
Yeah, there's a lot of profanity in my friendships.
It's true.
I don't know. I just love it. So now, of course, I own it, and I never don't think about my buddy Mike. So,
hi, Mike.
Anyway,
if you watch this.
Lovely story for you at home. I'm sure, by the way, if you have your own I made a friend with an old gun story, you can go ahead and comment or send that to us, because we love hearing that kind of stuff. It's fun. A community, people. All right. Well, I think that's it, right? Do you have any more?
I think that's everything on this guy for now.
Yeah, and for
we're going to get into some more Krags in a bit.
I don't have to ship one back.
That's kind of nice.
I own so few.
You just put it back on the rack.
Yeah. All right. Have a good one, everybody.
Night, guys.
All right, gang, today's update is a big thank you to all of you who helped out with engagement, commenting, liking, subscribing. I'm not sure if subscribing, anyway, you guys were helpful to us in order to get 300,000 subscribers. And more importantly, we have comments coming in all the time with people saying, "Where was I when this show came out? How has this been hiding in plain sight? Why did no one tell me about it?" Well, when you engage with the show, you've told people about it. And that's a big deal for us, because that means we can reach more people and we can help grow our show. And so, as a thank you to all of you, not just words, in action, I've sat down for quite a fair few hours in order to build, well, what you're seeing now, which is a section on our site that's known as the Primer Gallery. And it's a place where you can see all of the weapons we've covered in the Primer series in roughly chronological order with roughly their country's flags. This gets a little weird depending on who issued what and when it was adopted, but you get the idea. And I've gone so far as to scale them to the best of my ability. So you can now see all of those Primer weapons in their size comparison. And if you click each of these images, you can be taken to the episode that covers that particular firearm. And I'm going to try my best to keep this updated as we release new episodes. So again, thank you, and I hope this is a little fun toy to play with. All right, have a good one.